Hey guys, Theophilus Most Excellent here, and thanks for tuning into the video. In this one I actually want to address a claim that you're often going to hear, and that is that Satan and Lucifer in the Bible are not the same person. And just to let you know, in this video I'm going to be relying a lot upon the work of Dr. Michael Heiser, and especially his video entitled Genesis, the Serpent Nakash in the Garden of Eden. And I'll leave the link to it in the description, and I'll actually be playing some short clips of it in this video. But the reason for this is that Dr. Michael Heiser is actually a PhD in the Hebrew Bible and Semitic languages, and he himself actually cites in his video other experts of the Hebrew language to further make his case. And I say all this so that you'll know that my claims in this video about the Hebrew of certain Bible verses and the connections between various Old Testament passages, I didn't just make it up out of thin air or something. They're actually rigorous and scholarly, unlike the majority of videos you're going to find on YouTube about this topic. And that's really why I wanted to address this topic, because there's a lot of ignorance out there about it, and you're going to find like a lot of surface level arguments in those videos. And so with this video I want to go deeper than you're going to see with those other videos. And another thing that you're going to want to do is watch to the end of this video, because after I finish putting forth my perspective and offering my arguments, I'm going to deal with some of the more common stuff that you'll hear in some of those other videos that they use to try and prove their point. But to get started, I want to talk about Genesis 3 and the serpent there that deceives Adam and Eve, which traditionally is considered to be Satan. And we can actually see that the Bible does in fact plainly teach that the serpent here is Satan, and he's also called the devil. And you can see that in both Revelation 12 and 20 here on the screen. But my point in coming here is that Dr. Heiser in his video points out that the Hebrew behind the word serpent here, that is the word nakash, it's a triple entendre, meaning nakash here could technically be translated as either serpent, the most common way it's rendered, or could also be rendered deceiver, which, as we just saw in Revelation, Satan is known by that very name. But nakash can also be translated as shining one, and so each of these titles would be an accurate way to render the Hebrew term nakash here in Genesis 3.
The word for that being, that figure in the garden, is nakash. Nakash, as far as the root of the term, if we take nakash as the noun, that would be the word for serpent. Verbally, the verb means to deceive or practice divination. So nakash here could speak of or describe or imply a deceiver. If you're thinking of how this root is used adjectively or an alternative noun, the term would mean the shining one.
But again, this word is actually meant by the author to be a triple entendre, which essentially means that all three of those renderings are equally valid simultaneously. Nakash here means both serpent and deceiver and shining one all at once. In other words, one term shouldn't be chosen to the exclusion of the others. Rather, the character here in Genesis 3, he embodies all three meanings. And also realize that the original Hebrew audience that would have been reading this, they would have picked up on this connection instantly. Unlike the English reader, since in English the word serpent, it's not linguistically connected to those other two terms in any real way. But from there, I want to jump over to Ezekiel 28 really quick before we actually get to addressing Lucifer. And so Ezekiel 28 verses 12 through 19, it's a pretty famous passage that is thought by a lot of people to actually refer to Satan. And some of the reasons for that is that the subject here in this passage is actually spoken of as being a cherub, which is like an angelic being. And it also says that he was in the Garden of Eden at one point until he was cast out from the presence of God for sinning. And so to most people, these qualities would seem to align pretty well with what we know about the biblical Satan. But even beyond this, again, Heiser makes two further points about the Hebrew of this passage. One is that in verse 14, where the subject is actually called the anointed cherub, Heiser says that the Hebrew behind that could actually be rendered as the shining cherub.
So Ezekiel 28, the being is called an anointed cherub. Mashiach is the noun, mashak is the verb for to anoint. But even that term can come from a Semitic homonym, a word that's spelled the same but means something different. It has a Semitic homonym that means to shine. What a surprise. Okay, so we could actually have a shining cherub here.
And the other point that he makes is that the Hebrew in verse 12, where the subject is called the signet of perfection, that could actually be translated as the serpent of perfection.
There's a phrase, seal of perfection, in Ezekiel 28. It is chotem tachnit. Now, in Semitic, at times the M at the end of a noun is silent. It's called the enclitic mem. if that's the case here, and there are several others that occur in Ezekiel, then we don't have chotem, which is a signet ring or seal. We have chet vav tav. It's another word for serpent in Semitic languages. So we actually could translate this serpent of perfection.
And so this passage seems to have that same kind of connection that Genesis 3 had, that the serpent of Eden is the shining one, as we discussed before. And so with all that in mind, let's look at Isaiah 14, where the only specific mention of Lucifer actually occurs in the Bible. And so in Isaiah 14:12 is the mention of Lucifer, and the word Lucifer is actually a Latin derivation. It came in through the Latin Vulgate and wound up in the King James Version, which made it famous. But the Hebrew behind that word is actually Hillel, which many take that as a reference to the morning star Venus, but it actually literally means shining one. And you can see that from the sources on the screen, the New English translation and the Young's literal translation there. They both render Hillel literally as shining one, while the New American Standard, it gives the literal reading in the footnote. And so just to refresh your memory a bit, Satan, the Nakash from Genesis 3, literally means shining one. And also Satan from Ezekiel 28 is called the shining cherub. And so hopefully you can see there that it's entirely reasonable to consider the shining one of Isaiah 14 here, that is Lucifer, to be the same person from Genesis 3, the Nakash, the shining one, and the same person as Ezekiel 28, the shining cherub. Even further than that, though, Satan in the New Testament is also portrayed as having a luminous-like quality to him, and that would seem to lend credit to the idea that Satan is Lucifer, the shining one from Isaiah 14. And so one is in 2 Corinthians 11, where the Apostle Paul says that Satan appears as an angel of light to disguise his actual devious nature. And the other is in the Gospel of Luke, where Jesus says that he beheld Satan as if he were lightning, which would seem to indicate that Satan was shining or radiating some kind of light like lightning does when it strikes. And also think about the fact that Isaiah, the prophet here who's writing this, he was a Jew, and his primary language was Hebrew. He would have grown up reading the Genesis narrative about the Nakash, so he obviously would have been familiar with this triple entendre that's embedded into that word there. But even further than that, notice that Lucifer here, that is the shining one, he's actually said to be fallen from heaven. Well, elsewhere in the Bible, you'll find that Satan is actually fallen from heaven. So, yet again, you have another connection between Satan and this Lucifer character. And notice also the other similarities between all three of these passages, that is Genesis 3, Ezekiel 28, and Isaiah 14. In all three, the subject sins, and then he gets cursed by God, and Isaiah and Ezekiel actually both agree that pride was specifically involved in the sin. And so hopefully you can see from all these similarities and connections between these passages and even the Hebrew titles used for these persons that Lucifer from Isaiah 14 is in fact the biblical Satan. But now briefly, I just want to address some of the more common arguments you're going to hear against interpreting Lucifer here as Satan. And so the first one that I want to address is one that actually, even if it were true, it wouldn't really disprove that Lucifer in Isaiah 14 is Satan. And what it is that people will quibble over the Latin name Lucifer being used here. And I don't really know what the point of bringing that up is. I mean, if the person being referred to in Isaiah 14 is Satan, you can call him whatever you want. You can call him Hillel, you can call him Lucifer. Just think about other biblical characters who we call by names that are just merely translations, and nobody gripes about that. I mean, for example, Joshua from the book of Joshua in the Old Testament, his Hebrew name is not Joshua. Joshua's name in Hebrew is actually Yehoshua. And even Jesus in the original Greek of the New Testament, his name is not Jesus, it's Iesus. Jesus is just a translation of the Greek name. And yet I'm sure many of these people refer to Jesus from the New Testament as just that. And also take for instance that the term Lord, referring to God's name in the Old Testament, God's name is not Lord, it's closer in Hebrew to Yahweh. But I mean, think about these names. The tradition of substituting Lord for Yahweh, it's even found in the New Testament. And then take also for instance Jesus' name, Iesus. Jesus was Jewish and he would have actually had a Hebrew name, not a Greek one. And even Joshua in the New Testament gets a Greek name. And so if using those kinds of titles for biblical characters is fine, mind, I don't really see how using Lucifer to refer to the person in Isaiah 14 can be considered wrong or inaccurate in some way. The Latin term Lucifer has just become the normative title that we refer to that person with, just like how Jesus has become the normative name substituted for the Greek name Jesus. But again, either way, whether you call him Hillel or Lucifer or whatever you call him, that doesn't really prove whether this person is Satan or not. But another common argument that you're going to run into is that the person in Isaiah 14:12 can't be Satan, because verse 4 clearly says that it's the king of Babylon that God is saying these things to. And so I would respond to that by saying that both of these interpretations can actually be mutually true. And so what I mean by that is that this passage here can be what's known as a prefigurement. And so what I mean is God can be speaking to both the fallen angel Satan as well as his prefigurement, the king of Babylon. And we can actually see that kind of thing going on in Scripture in other places. And so, for example, in 2 Samuel 7, God gives a prophecy to David that both applies to Jesus Christ and to David's son Solomon. And so the prophecy is actually a dual prediction in that it was simultaneously a prophecy about two people, and both people ended up fulfilling it. One person fulfilled it in that era when God gave it, and another person fulfilled it in the Messianic age, which is the greater fulfillment. So that's one point, but another one that's even stronger is that to say this can't be Satan simply because it's initially addressed to a wicked king is to set a standard that's actually unbiblical. And so what I mean by that is that if you take that same standard and you apply it to the other passages that we spoke about, that is Ezekiel 28, you're going to see that the standard just doesn't work, because Ezekiel 28 is also addressed to a wicked king, that is the king of Tyre. Yet we know that God is definitely not solely speaking to the king of Tyre there, because the literal king of Tyre was not a cherub or a serpent, and he definitely was never in the Garden of Eden, as God says of the person in Ezekiel 28. And so again, as I was saying before, that passage in Ezekiel 28 is also probably a prefigurement passage, where you have a fulfillment in the era when the prophecy was given, and yet you have a greater fulfillment in the fact that it's about Satan. And so obviously if that kind of thing can be true about Ezekiel 28, the same thing can be true of Lucifer in the Isaiah 14 passage. And in fact, in Isaiah 14, we do seem to find similar elements where it would seem to make the subject out as being more than just some mere king. For example, the subject in Isaiah 14 is quoted as having plotted to dethrone God and usurp his position and power and authority. And I seriously doubt that the literal king of Babylon ever had such a thought. I mean, Nebuchadnezzar, the king of Babylon, in the book of Daniel, is portrayed as hardly even knowing who God is. He always calls him the God of so-and-so and such a person, like he just doesn't even know his name, let alone does he have this enormous plot to sit on God's throne and steal all his power. But one that's even more obvious is one that I already mentioned, and that's in verse 12, where Lucifer is said to be fallen from heaven. That can't possibly be true of an earthly king, but rather, as I pointed out, it's Satan in the Bible that's said to be fallen from heaven. And so, just like the subject of Ezekiel 28, the qualities of Lucifer here seem to be beyond that of a mere king, and in fact seem to better fit with Satan himself. But the third and final argument against seeing Lucifer as Satan here in Isaiah 14 is that in verse 16 of this very chapter, the individual is literally called a man. And so how can he be the fallen angel Satan if he's a man? And so the way I would address this is to point out that the term man used in verse 16 is actually the Hebrew word ish. It can be translated person or fellow individual or simply him sometimes. It often merely just denotes a person who is male and not necessarily that individual's species or anything like that. And there's actually a separate Hebrew word which would more specifically denote the human species or mankind. And that word is Adam, like Adam from Genesis. His name just basically means mankind. And so if Isaiah wanted the reader to know that this person in verse 16 is a humanoid, the word he would have used was Adam and not Ish. And even beyond that, this argument, just like the last one, also has an unbiblical standard, because we have passages in the Old Testament where other angelic beings are called man with the term Ish, just like here. So for instance, Gabriel, who is an angel, is referred to as a man in Daniel 9, and it's with the same Hebrew term Ish that's used of Lucifer in Isaiah 14. And another one is actually in Genesis 18, where Abraham sees three, quote, men, who actually turn out to be God and two angels. And again, it's the same Hebrew term Ish used. And so if those angels can be called a man or men, that is the Hebrew word Ish, I see no reason why Satan, who is also an angel, cannot be called the same title. Also keep in mind that the connection between mankind and man is an English concept that the Hebrew doesn't have, because, as I said, Adam is the word for mankind, and Ish and Adam are not linguistically connected in the same way that mankind and man are connected in English. And so man in these passages that I've just showed you and in Isaiah 14, they simply refer to this person's gender being male, not necessarily to them being humanoid males. I mean, even God himself was called a man in Genesis 18 there, though obviously he was not a man at that point, but rather God is always depicted as being male in gender.